States. He could have changed it. Was it a mistake?
No, it was an important first step, Wolf. I mean, you know, there's a certain, I want to go back to my friend Joe Biden, because he's been around longer than any of us have in the Congress. And, you know, talking, he's a young man, he started young. But talking about this as though there is a reality out there that a president or a Congress can change with the snap of a finger does a grave disservice to the American people. We have a political process. There's checks and balances, and Joe remembers very well the Congress was adamantly opposed at the time to letting gays and lesbians serve openly. Don't ask, don't tell was the compromise policy.
But you better tell us, if you were president, Senator Clinton, what would your husband do?
This is a fascinating question. They asked the Republicans, they asked the Democrats, and I think from the perspective of what you've already heard, I believe in using former presidents. I think we should have everybody helping us to repair the damage of the last, by then, 8 years. And when I become president, Bill Clinton, my dear husband, will be one of the people who will be sent around the world as a roving ambassador to make it very clear to the rest of the world that we're back to a policy of reaching out and working and trying to make friends and allies and stopping the alienation of the rest of the world. There's not a problem we face, from global terrorism to global warming or HIV/AIDS or bird flu or tuberculosis, where we don't need friends and allies. And he would be a tremendous help in our country's effort to redo that again.
Thank you, Senator.
I'd like to ask, how would you approach solving the problem we have with Iran today? Would you use force or would you use diplomacy? And if you use diplomacy, what would you do?
All right, let's let Senator Clinton first respond to that.
Well, I am very concerned about Iran, and I believe that we should have been using diplomacy for a number of years now. I am, I guess, pleased that the administration is starting to talk to the Iranians, but it is way overdue. We have allowed the Iranians to begin their nuclear program, to imprison Iranian Americans as they are now, to send weapons across their borders to be used against our young men and women. And we need a process of engagement. You know, the president's policy has been, we don't talk in this administration to people we don't agree with or that we think are bad. All during the Cold War, we always talked to the Soviet Union. They had missiles pointed at us. They had leaders who said they would bury us. They waged wars around the world. We never stopped talking. In my administration, diplomacy, patient, careful diplomacy, the kind of diplomacy that Bill Richardson did for my husband, that really gets people to stay with it over time. Are you always going to get good results? No, but you've got to start the process. However, we still have to make it clear that Iran having a nuclear weapon is absolutely unacceptable. We have to try to prevent that at all costs, but we need to start with diplomacy in order to see what we can accomplish.
So what happens, Senator, if diplomacy, when all is said and done, fails?
Well, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals, because we've had an administration that doesn't believe in diplomacy. You know, they have every so often Condi Rice go around the world and show up somewhere and make a speech, and occasionally they even send Dick Cheney. That's hardly diplomatic in my view. So from what I would say, we won't know until we get a president who is committed to diplomacy and will do things like use the great diplomats that have come up through our country, use former presidents, use people like Bill Richardson. Only then will we be able to make a clear assessment. I just hope we have enough time, because unfortunately we have many months to go before this administration is done.
A number of the candidates have talked about alliance building, and I wanted to ask about a specific country. The U.S. has had close relations with Pakistan as part of the war in Afghanistan and part of the war on terror. How do you reconcile our security interest with Pakistan with our interest in promoting liberal democracy? Pakistan is not a democratic country.
Let's throw that question to Senator Clinton.
Well, it's a really important question, because we have been supporting Pakistan through President Musharraf now for a number of years. And it is clear that he has not moved toward democracy, but has solidified his rule and become quite anti-democratic with his removal of the Chief Justice and many of the other moves that he's taken. At the same time, we depend upon him to try to control the tribal areas, out of which come the resurgent Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters who crossed the border into Afghanistan. Again, this is an area where I think the United States needs to be just focused like the proverbial laser. When I was in Pakistan and Afghanistan in January, I met with both President Karzai and President Musharraf, and I asked them if it would help to have a high-level presidential envoy working with both of them to try to figure out how we can move toward what are American interests and how we can keep Pakistan from undermining the war against the Taliban and al-Qaeda.
Right.
And unfortunately, when I got back and I called the White House and I made this suggestion, it fell on deaf ears. So there's a lot we need to do, and it's a very difficult, thorny problem how to address it.
Raise their hand and tell me if you agree that if the U.S. had intelligence that could take out Osama bin Laden and kill him, even though some innocent civilians would die in the process, would you, as president, authorize such an operation? If you would, raise your hand.
It would depend on how many innocent civilians.
Yeah, I mean, part of this is one of these
That's not enough
hypotheticals,
information.
Wolf, that is
Not enough
very
information.
difficult to answer in the abstract. You know, my husband actually tried to take out bin Laden. You know, he did fire missiles at a training camp that we had intelligence that that's where bin Laden was, because by that time, bin Laden had already bombed our embassies. Bin Laden had already demonstrated his hostility toward the United States. But you can't just, you have to be very careful about how you proceed. So, you know, yes, if we could do it without a tremendous amount of collateral damage, I think maybe with one or two exceptions, we would give the order to do it, knowing what a weighty responsibility.
As Democrats have vowed to weed out corruption in the federal government, a major source of corruption for both Democrats and Republicans are bribes in spending bills, sometimes referred to as earmarks. Would you vow, if elected president, to veto all bills containing earmarks? And Wolf, of course, earmarks the pork spending that sometimes gets added to legislation without anybody really knowing about it.
Well, Senator Clinton?
Well, I think it's important to remember that 6 years ago we had a balanced budget and a surplus. And we did that the old-fashioned way by cutting spending and raising revenues. There is no free lunch. We're going to have to do that hard work again. Now, my point is, when it comes to the tax questions that were asked, the benefits from the Bush tax cuts have gone disproportionately to a very small percentage of Americans. And 10% of Americans have realized about 50% of the increase in wealth that has happened in this country in the last 6 years. We need to deal with the burden on the middle class. The alternative minimum tax has to be reformed, hopefully eventually eliminated. But I think it's important to point out that we have done this before, not in ancient history, but within our memory, and we can do it again once we have a Democratic president.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to go. What would be, Senator Clinton, your top priority in the first 100 days?
Well, if President Bush has not ended the war in Iraq, to bring our troops home. That would be the very first thing that I would do.
All right.